Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So on behalf of William Daroff, Malcolm Hoenlein, and myself, we appreciate your joining us for this Zoom entitled Counting America's Jews, the Results of the 2021 Pew Study. We're very fortunate to be joined by Alan Cooperman, who is Director of Religion Research for the Pew Center. He's an expert on religion's role in US politics and has reported on religion in Russia, the Middle East, and Europe. He plays a central role in planning the project's research agenda and writing its reports. Before joining Pew Research Center, he was a national reporter and editor at the Washington Post and a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press and US News and World Report. He's an author and editor of many books, and he's appeared many times on numerous news outlets. Alan, I didn't ask whether you wanted to be on the record or off the record today. Do you have a point of view?
I'm happy to be on the record as long as you all are gentle with me.
Okay, that sounds fair. So Alan's going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have start with Q&A. And as always, please use the hand raise function for Q&A. So Alan, thank you very much again, and the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen. This is always the awkward part of these things, and I apologize for that. But let's get this going.
I think you're going to be okay. It says Alan has started screen sharing. There you go.
There we go. And you should be seeing it, so you're all seeing it. And now, unfortunately, I can't see all of you. So if you're kind of raising your hand to ask a question, if you really want to butt in, you may have to just unmute yourself. I won't consider it rude. We're a small group. We're among friends. I was told that, because of the unfortunate timing of the release of this report, which we didn't have control over. We had set the release date long in advance, but it happened just as the unfortunate events were going on in Israel and Gaza, that a lot of people didn't have the bandwidth, which is very understandable, to focus on the report at the time. So I was asked for this to kind of give an overview of the results, and 10 minutes is probably a bit optimistic for that, but I don't want to bore you to tears. I do want to leave time for conversation. So let me get going, and at a certain point, maybe I'll break for questions partway through, and then we can kind of take it from there. And indeed, feel free to interrupt. Pew Research Center, you probably all know, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, advocacy research center, so we don't take policy positions and we don't make recommendations on anything we do, including religion. Religion is just one of the areas we study, and we study religion because we think that it matters in individuals' lives and in society's lives, but not because we're promoting any particular religion or religion as a whole over non-religion. And our primary funder is the Pew Charitable Trusts. They keep the lights on for us for some really big and expensive, complicated projects like this Jewish survey. We do go to sometimes to outside foundations or individuals for additional support. In the case of the 2020 study, as with our 2013 study of American Jews, the two sources of funding, and the only two sources of funding, were the Pew Charitable Trust and the Neubauer Family Foundation. That's Joe and Jeanette Neubauer in Philadelphia. Quickly, as I go over the results today, I'm going to talk in three kind of buckets. I'm going to talk about some elements of stability. Those are largely demographic. I'm going to talk about some elements of change, and they include anti-Semitism and what I'm going to call religious divergence. I'm choosing that language very carefully, and by religious divergence, I have in mind the apparent growth at kind of polar ends of the Jewish spectrum of traditionalism, particularly among younger Jews. So growth both of Orthodox and in particular of Haredim, and also growth of people who consider themselves Jewish, but not by religion. As we go, we should keep in mind some very important issues that put degrees of uncertainty on these results. And, as a surveyor, I'm the first to always say, you need to take everything with a grain of salt, be careful about it, and I want to help you do that. Remember that the 2013 study, Barack Obama was president. The 2020 study took place under the Trump administration, and obviously we're now in a different administration. And the study was largely done, almost entirely completed before the coronavirus struck. So this should be seen as a kind of status quo anti-coronavirus. And also there are some important methodological differences between the 2013 study and the 2020 study. So I'm going to quickly talk about methodology, but I'm happy to get deeper into the details on this. And it's all spelled out in gory detail in our 250-page report, which is freely available on our website at pewresearch.org. So you know that back in 2013, we did that study by telephone, random digit dialing. Uh, uh, Unfortunately, because of caller ID and other technological developments, response rates to telephone surveys have plummeted. They're today less than a third of what they were as recently as 2013. So that was not the right way to do the study again in 2020. And instead, we did what's called an address-based sample. So it's very important to know that we did not start with lists of Jews or with people with Jewish sounding last names or anything like that. This survey begins with a very broad sample of the general American public. We took the US Postal Service's master sequential list of all residential addresses in the United States. We stratified it, that is, we divided it up into geographic regions, and we sent tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of letters to randomly selected addresses within those particular geographic strata. And we asked the people who received those letters to take a short screening survey in one of two ways, either to go to a secure website online and insert a particular number that was included in their letter, so as a personal identifier, or to fill out a brief survey on paper. We got about 2/3 of our responses online, but it's very important to realize you did not have to have online access or be comfortable with a computer or own a computer or have internet access to be able to complete this survey. We had a response rate very similar to what we got in 2013, 17% this time around, which is quite good these days for surveys. And of the many thousands of people that we attempted to reach, we completed screening interviews with about 68,000. That's very similar to what we had in 2013. And we identified about 5,000 people who can be considered Jewish in one way or another. And the two primary ways that we qualify people as Jewish is, one, if they say their religion is Jewish, and two, if they say that they have no religion, that is, they're atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, but they consider themselves Jewish aside from religion, and they have at least one Jewish parent, sometimes two Jewish parents, but they have to have at least one to be in that second category of Jews of no religion. Again, as I noted, the survey was conducted almost entirely before the coronavirus pandemic struck. It did go into June, but that's mainly because some paper surveys were still coming in through the mails. Most of the survey was done before the pandemic accelerated in March of 2020. Because we did the survey differently methodologically in 2020 than we did in 2013, we included a very complex separate experiment in which we took a certain number of separate respondents and randomly allocated them either to be interviewed by telephone or online or on paper. And this was to determine how differently Jews answer questions when speaking with a live interviewer rather than writing them down while in private, either on a computer or on a piece of paper. And alas, it turns out quite differently. This is not news to us because we've done these kinds of studies with the general public before. What survey people call mode effects are important. Well, the takeaway for you all to realize is that because of these differences, one cannot take the 2013 study and lay it up against the 2020 study and look at the very same questions and say, this much has changed and this is real change over time. We simply can't do that. It's one reason why the report is so long and complicated, because we analyze this by each question and look at it very carefully. Again, we can talk more about that, but this is a major complicating factor. The good news on that side is that almost certainly this is the way that surveys are going to be done in the future. This is already the way the highest quality surveys in the United States are being done, with address-based sample and this kind of mail to web, as it's called, approach. And so in the future, we will have comparable data. We'll use the 2020 data as a baseline instead of 2013. So I would now want to quickly talk about some important areas of stability. And I try to be as subjective as a human being can be in talking about these things. So talking about good news and bad news is not really my standard approach, but I will note, I will say that I think I can understand Jewish leaders. And I would say for many Jewish leaders, these are going to come across as good news. And I think that that is maybe an important thing to recognize, because I believe that the 2013 study was often portrayed as a lot of bad news. In fact, the New York Times called it grim news for American Jews. I don't think that that's what one sees in the 2020 study. So to begin with, the Jewish population itself is pretty stable. As a percentage of American adults, we found that Jews, that is both Jews by religion and Jews of no religion, people who identify as Jewish because it's their religion, and this other group of what one think of as cultural or ethnic Jews, together in 2013 made up 2.2% of the US population. Find almost an identical figure using a very different methodology in 2020 at 2.4%. And in real numbers, well, that's steady in percentage terms. In real numbers, the US population, of course, is growing, and the Jewish population is probably growing. In fact, our estimate of the size of the Jewish population using similar definitions, basically identical definitions in 2013 and 2020, 6.7 million in 2013, 7.5 million in 2020. And just as a note, you know, at Pew Research Center, we don't just study Jews, we study religions in the United States and all around the world. And you should realize that that's a bit exceptional, that the number of Christians in the United States is declining, both in percentage terms and in real terms. And that's true of all the major subdivisions of Christians in the United States. That's true even of evangelical Protestants, declining in percentage terms. So the fact that the Jewish population is holding steady or slightly growing in percentage terms is actually quite an important thing. The subdivisions, the classic subdivisions or branches or streams or denominations, whatever term you want to use within American Judaism, are also quite stable. Reform is the largest, followed by those who don't identify with any stream, so-called unaffiliated Jews. Conservative branch, Orthodox, about 10% in both years, in 2013 and 2020. And then other branches, Reconstructionist Judaism, Humanist Judaism, and so on, making up a handful of percentage points of the Jewish population. Last but not least in this stability category, intermarriage. So we ask all the married respondents in the survey about the religion of their spouse. And we're going to count as intermarried those who say that at present, at the time of their survey, their spouse is not Jewish. Okay, so if at the time they got married, the spouse was not Jewish, but the spouse has since converted formally or informally, that's not an intermarriage. If you say today that your spouse is Jewish, then you are counted as in married. But 44% of the married respondents in 2013 said their spouse was not Jewish at the time of the survey. And at the time of the 2020 survey, 42% said their spouse was not Jewish. So virtually identical. Now, of course, there's good evidence that intermarriage rates have risen over time. So we don't find any evidence of an increase from 2013 to 2020, but when we look at the year of marriage, and we ask people in what year they got married, we see that people who've gotten married more recently are more likely to be intermarried. And in fact, in those who got married in the last decade before the study, 60-some percentage points are intermarried. That is, they say their spouse is not Jewish at present. And of course, there's virtually no intermarriage among Orthodox Jews. So if we separate out the Orthodox and look only at non-Orthodox Jews, then we'll see that it's 70-some percent, 72% in the most recent 10-year cohort of marriages are intermarried. But I would like to point out to you that those two figures I just gave you, the 62% or 61% and 72%, 61% overall and 72% among non-Orthodox marriages in the last 10 years, those are identical to the numbers we found in approximately the 10-year tranche of marriages before the 2013 study. So again, there's evidence that intermarriage has been rising over time, but there really is no evidence of any increase in intermarriage rates between the 2013 study and the 2020 study. You may remember, moving on away from demographics to some substantive issues, that we had this set of questions we asked in 2013 about what being Jewish means to you personally. And we stressed that to you personally, what does it mean to be Jewish? And what's essential versus what's important but not essential, and what's not important. And you may remember that the largest number of American Jews in 2013 said that remembering the Holocaust was essential to what being Jewish meant to them. Well, we find basically the same findings this time around. Because of the differences methodologically, we shouldn't line these numbers up exactly, but the pattern, the order in which people say what's important and what's essential to them is virtually identical. We added one new item this time. It's right in the middle of the chart. Continuing family traditions. 51% of Jewish adults say that continuing family traditions is essential to what being Jewish means to them. But again, things like observing Jewish law, observing halacha, is for most American Jews not an essential part of what being Jewish is. Whereas remembering the Holocaust, leading an ethical and moral life, and working for justice and equality in society are deemed essential by solid majorities of American Jews. And we can look at these data and do in the report by age and by Jewish denomination and so on. And I'm happy to answer questions and talk about that. I'm trying to give you broad brush findings right now, and I'm trying to race through it so we have time to talk. We also asked in this set of questions about what does it mean to be Jewish. We asked a separate question. We said, is being Jewish to you, is that mainly a matter of religion, or mainly a matter of culture, or mainly a matter of ancestry? You know, interestingly, Jews are kind of all over the lot on this. And there's no one answer that predominates. And quite a few people, in fact, one of the largest answer categories is it's all three. But it is interesting to note that it's a minority of American Jews who mention religion at all. It's most American Jews will say that it's a matter of ancestry or culture or both, and not even mention religion. Of course, that's not true for Orthodox Jews, but it's an interesting finding that was also true in 2013. That's why this is in the stability category. A few other points in terms of stability. It shouldn't be a surprise to you on conventional measures of religious belief and behavior. And I'm going to stress that conventional. They may not be fully appropriate, but in conventional measures like how important is religion in your life? And do you believe in God? And what is the God you believe in? What kind of God do you believe in? Do you believe in the God of the Bible, or do you believe in some other higher power, spiritual force in the universe? And how often do you attend religious services? So all these measures, Jewish adults as a whole are a lot less religious than the US general public. That's not even comparing to US Christians or other groups. And again, we know Jews are not monolithic. So if we were to look at Orthodox Jews, that'd be a very different picture. But this is Jews as a whole are not in relative terms a particularly religious population. That was true in 2020. It's still true in 2013. We asked a new question in 2020 because there's been a lot of interest in research and sociological research about where people find meaning and fulfillment in their lives. And so we asked American Jews and US adults as a whole where they find meaning and fulfillment in their lives, and how much meaning and fulfillment they find in various categories. And you'll find that on most of these categories, Jews look a lot like the US public. Identical shares of American Jews and of US adults as a whole say they get a lot of meaning and fulfillment out of spending time with their family. And actually, pretty close to identical numbers say that being outdoors, spending time with pets, career, job, education, so on. Jews are a little more likely to say that they get a great deal of meaning, fulfillment out of arts and literature than the general public. And they are a lot less likely than the general public to say that they get a lot of meaning and fulfillment out of their religious faith. Now, again, religious faith is a strange phrase for American Jews. It may have a bit of a Protestant ring, that may be part of what's going on here, the word faith, but that's the way we ask the question for the general public, and this is what we find. All right, so I would like now to get to the more interesting part of the conversation, which is to talk about some of the things that we see signs of change. But should I pause, Diane, for a moment so that I'm not just...
Yeah. I think maybe like 1 or 2 questions, and if it's something that you're going to cover in the presentation, I think it would be perfectly appropriate for you to answer that way.
Yafé me'od. Perfect. Let's do that.
And I think Rachel, I have a question that I'm going to want to go back to, but Rachel, maybe one of the questions, somebody on the screen, if you would.
Sure. The first question is from Mort Klein of the ZOA.
Hi, Alan. Thank you very much for your hard work in putting this together. My question is, I find it hard to feel confident in this survey, primarily because when I see from 2013 to 2020 to 21, Orthodox Jews went from 10 to 9, and the Reform went up. When Orthodox Jews are having many more children, Reform are having much fewer children and intermarrying, how on earth in the last 7 years could Orthodox not have gone up and Reform have gone down? It just goes against my sense of these things. Am I wrong in thinking that?
No, you're not wrong. So there's a few possibilities, and I am going to show you there are clear signs in the survey of what's happening in terms of birth rates among the Orthodox. And you're absolutely right. The Orthodox birth rates are a lot higher. But there are a few things to bear in mind. First of all, the difference between 10% and 9% is not statistically significant. That's not a decline. Given the methodological differences, it really behooves us to see that as stability in the overall percentage of all Jews who are Orthodox. Now, when we think about change, denominational change, there are a few things you need to bear in mind. One is birth rates, and they're very important for the Orthodox, but the other is religious switching. That is, people who leave Orthodoxy or who move from one Jewish denomination, branch or stream to another. And the movement is basically downhill, if you want to think of it as a ladder or a hill of religiosity or traditionalism. There's relatively little movement from Reform to conservative, from conservative to Orthodox. There's a lot of movement down the opposite direction. And we recently posted something, I'll send it to you online, but if you look at the overall Jewish population and how people tell you they were raised and what they are today, Orthodox is a net loser through religious switching. Reform is a net gainer through religious switching. Now that's leaving everything else aside. But again, birth rates aren't the whole picture. They're only part of the picture. The other thing is that 7 years is not a really long period of time. So again, if we had 20 years between these studies, I think we would pick up more difference. And the last thing, I neither want to undercut your degree of confidence in the survey, nor do I want to overstate its precision. Because of the methodological changes, there are things that we're not sure about. And it could be that we didn't get as many older Orthodox adults as we should have, that their response rates were lower because the survey was conducted partly online. Now, again, let me stress that we did offer people the opportunity to fill this out on paper and send it back to us, and we made it very easy for them to do it. And a third of our responses came in that way. And we did get older Orthodox adults, but it's one of those things. It's what your friend Don Rumsfeld would have called an unknown unknown. We don't know what we don't know, and it's very hard to assess response rates in that way. So, okay,
we'll take one more question now, Alan, if that's okay, and then we'll go back to the presentation. Rachel?
The next question is from Harriet Schleifer of AJC.
Hi, Harriet.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing this amazing information with us. I noticed that in the priorities of identified Jews, they're listing, 15% observing halakha, but 59% justice and equality. And I look to see what's important as well regarding Israel, and we have Israel in the middle at 45%. And, I'm wondering whether the correlation of a universalistic outlook on the part of Jews correlates to having a sense of the importance of Israel in the middle, as opposed to something, higher on the list. So number one, do you think that there's a correlation? And number two, from a historical point of view in the American public, were these similar numbers in terms of universalism and the degree of concern or identification with Israel? Is that something that is steady, or has that correlation seemed to change?
Well, you're asking a tough question because I haven't thought a lot about how to measure universalism as an attitude and how to then statistically see whether it correlates. Perhaps rather more crudely, Harriet, the correlations that I can see are with age and with a Jewish branch or denomination. Among Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews, caring about Israel rates much more highly as a whole. And we see with a variety of other questions, because there are 15 or so questions about Israel in the survey, that in general, Orthodox Jews are extremely emotionally attached to Israel, as are most conservative Jews, and as are quite a few Reform Jews. It's the what we sometimes call, it's a not a beautiful moniker, but the Jews of no religion,
The nuns.
cultural ethnic Jews,
The nuns.
The nuns, they are much lower in their attachments to Israel. Again, I am a little hesitant to try to suspect that universalism is part of it, that it may be part of it. And age is also really interesting. Younger Jews are less attached to Israel, and I'll show that later on in a variety of ways. And that's even though the younger age population contains a very high share of Orthodox Jews, but it also contains a high share of nuns, as you put them, the Jews of no religion. So there are some other things that one can look at. My friend and colleague Len Sachs, whose vacation home is just down the street from me here in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Len has access to all the birthright data, and he also worked on this survey with us, and he believes that using statistical controls, that one can show that having visited Israel, and particularly on a birthright trip, increases attachment. We can only see that there's a consistent pattern in the survey that having visited Israel, people who visited Israel are more emotionally attached to Israel, but we can't prove causality, because it could be that the ones who are more emotionally attached are more likely to have gone in the first place. So you need to have the data that we don't have, that Len has, to try to make the real case that it's causality. Other things, years of Jewish education, more years of Jewish education and camp, same sorts of statistical correlations with caring about Israel, but also the same chicken and egg question. Those are families and individuals who were attached to Israel to begin with. So I don't know that the years of schooling or the camp may produce that attachment, rather than that attachment produce the years of camp and schooling, if you see where I'm going. That's the best quick answer I can give you, but it's a terrifically good question. I encourage you and everybody else to bring your own, your own noggins to this. And the question about universalism is a very interesting one. I'll give that some more thought.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks. Why don't we go back to the share screen again, Alan? Thanks so much.
Okay, do I think I need to share the screen again? Yes, probably I do.
Yeah, it's coming up.
Oh, is it coming up? Okay, great. All right, so signs of change. So let me just step back for a second and recall that when in 2013, we met with a set of advisors, wonderful set of advisors. Len Sachs was one in 2013, Sergio Della Pergola from Israel, a bunch of other folks. And we sat around in a room with them and we talked about, so big picture, what's important to cover in this survey? And I asked anti-Semitism. How much time and energy do we need to devote in the survey to anti-Semitism? And frankly, it's sobering to recall that in 2013, the advisors said, well, of course, there's still anti-Semitism, but it's not a pressing issue for American Jews. Well, along comes 2020, and I'm afraid that's just not the case. In the wake of shootings in Poway and Pittsburgh and supermarkets and all the things that you know too well. And it turns my stomach to even begin to talk about them, but anti-Semitism is a much bigger issue. So we asked a lot more questions about anti-Semitism this time around. And one of the questions we asked is, do you think there's more anti-Semitism in the United States than there was 5 years ago? And 3/4 of American Jews say yes. And most of the rest say it's about the same amount. And it's only 5% who think there's less anti-Semitism at the time of the survey than there was 5 years earlier. We also asked a question and we said, to you personally, as an American Jew, do you feel less safe in America than you did 5 years ago? 53% of American Jews told us they feel less safe personally as a Jew in America than they did 5 years earlier. Most of the rest said there was not much change. There are a few who weren't living in America 5 years ago, and there are 3% who say they feel more safe as a Jew in America than they did 5 years ago. Now, we took that 53% and we asked a follow-up question. And the follow-up question was designed to try to figure out, well, what's the real impact on this, of this fear, of this insecurity on people's activities? We said, because you feel less safe, have you hesitated to participate in any Jewish observances or events? And then we said, and if you hesitated, what did you ultimately do? Did you go ahead and participate anyway, or did you not participate? So this bar chart is based on the 53% who say they felt less safe, but it's also as a percentage of the total. So these numbers are of all Jews, okay? So 35% say they have not hesitated. So 53% say they feel less safe. 35% of all Jews say they feel less safe, but they haven't hesitated to participate in any events. 12% say they have hesitated, but they went ahead and participated. And 5% of American Jews say they have hesitated because they feel less safe, and they ultimately did not participate. I don't want to consider that a small number. 5% is a considerable number, but it is also important to keep it in perspective. So I think what we're seeing here is that Jews feel less safe, but for the most part, it's not, from what we can see in this survey, which is not the whole picture, but for the most part, it's not affecting their decision of whether to participate in Jewish life in various ways. At least that's the best we can see here. Now, we also asked a bunch of questions about particular kinds of experiences, ranging in severity from have you been physically attacked or threatened, to have you been harassed online, have you been called offensive names. All of these things are because you're a Jew. The predicate for this question is because you are Jewish or have a Jewish background, have these things happen to you in the past year. Been called offensive names because you're a Jew in the past year, been made to feel unwelcome someplace because you're a Jew in the past year, or seen anti-Jewish graffiti or vandalism. Again, I don't know how to characterize these numbers. I certainly wouldn't characterize them as small. I think it's clear that when you get to sort of things like seeing anti-Jewish graffiti, you get much larger numbers than things like being physically threatened or attacked. I think the other pattern that's very clear is that Orthodox Jews are experiencing more of some of these things than Jews overall or Jews in the other streams. That stands to reason because Orthodox Jews are probably more likely to be visibly Jewish on the outside in their daily life, and also because they may be living, well, because they generally do live in more Jewish enclaves, more identifiably Jewish neighborhoods. So for those reasons, these patterns. I'll give you just a moment to absorb these numbers. Again, we could look at these by age, we can look at these by gender, we can look at, we don't have a great deal of ability to break this out geographically, unfortunately, because of relatively small sample sizes. I couldn't tell you in Chicago what these numbers are, for example. We also asked for the first time set of questions. I'm going to be a little bit honest. They make me queasy even to ask these questions, but we thought it was important enough. We talked with our advisors and we asked about various kinds of Jewish tropes or stereotypes. I do want to emphasize that we were careful in the way we asked this to distinguish between firsthand events and what one might call hearsay, that is, between what you have heard in your physical presence versus what you've heard from someone else or read about, heard secondhand. And we find actually that quite a few American Jews, 43% overall, have heard or read secondhand this stereotype that Jews care too much about money, and 30% have heard this in the past year in their presence. The notion that the Holocaust did not happen or is exaggerated, 63% of American Jews have heard or read about that. 9% have heard it in their presence. And that doesn't vary very much by stream of Judaism. And this notion of a kind of dual loyalty accusation that Jews really care more about Israel than they do about the United States. 36% of American Jews have heard this. On my screen, I can't actually see the summary numbers because I've got your beautiful faces covering them up, but we have the summary numbers, and you can see it's not inconsiderable shares of the Jewish population that have heard in their presence at least one of these items in the past year. Again, we have no historical comparable data because it's the first time we've asked this question. And one thing I'll be interested to hear from some of you is how you feel about this question. Is this a question you think it's ethical, responsible for us to ask, or does this make you queasy even to ask these things, and should we not be doing this? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Now I want to turn to the trend that I called religious divergence. And I'm deliberately using that term. I'm not using polarization, because polarization has a political ring to it. But more, this is kind of what you were thinking about. If we look at streams of Judaism, branches, denominations, and we divide the population up by age, we see a very clear pattern. Orthodox, and in particular ultra-Orthodox, are growing. So that 17% figure, a majority of those folks are not just identifying as Orthodox, but are actually identifying as Haredi in one way or another. That is, they're saying they're either Hasidic or Chabad, they're saying they're Litvish or Yeshivish, as opposed to modern or centrist Orthodox. So most of those folks are either Litvish, Yeshivish, Aguda, or they're Chabad or Hasidic in that 17%. And it's quite a striking pattern. Now, if we look at the same thing for conservative and Reform Jews, we kind of find the reverse pattern. That is declining numbers by age group who are identifying as conservative or Reform. And conservative and Reform are still, even among younger Jews, the largest, the plurality. But if you look at Jews over the age of 65, 7 in 10 identify as either conservative or Reform. And among Jews under the age of 30, Jewish adults under the age of 30, it's closer to a third. So there's a precipitous fall off by generation there. And then the final category is what we've called a little bit the nones or unaffiliated Jews. There's sort of coterminous here, people who don't identify with any particular branch. Now, some people who don't identify with Jewish by religion, that is, they're just cultural or ethnic Jews, do nonetheless identify with a branch. So those are not exactly the same thing. But again, by age, what the pattern that we see here overall is that both the Orthodox share and the share who are at the kind of the far other end of the spectrum of traditionalism and observance, both of those are growing. And kind of the traditional middle of American Judaism seems to be in decline in percentage terms by age group. Now, the other way we can look at this is with this other set of categories of people who identify either with the Jewish religion, and we see that that is declining by age, or those who are the Jewish nones, those who don't identify with the Jewish religion, and they're rising by age. And I often get this question, Alan, why are you doing this silly binary division between Jews by religion and Jews of no religion? They're all Jews. Why don't we just treat us all as Jews, et cetera? And the reason is twofold, because in a normal survey, we only capture Jews by religion. 99% of American surveys that ask people about their religion classify religious groups by who says what their religion is. There's no such thing as ethnically or culturally Protestant. And so most surveys don't capture this. We go out of our way in this survey to capture a broader definition of who's Jewish, and it includes people who don't identify with the Jewish religion. As long as they have a Jewish parent, they don't identify with any other religion. They're not Christians, they're not Buddhists, they're not Hindus, they're not Wiccans, and they do consider themselves Jewish in some way. So that's what this Jews of no religion category is. The other reason that I make this break, though, is by no means the only way of looking at the data. Again, we can look at it by age, we can look at it by gender, we can look by region, we can do a lot of different things, but it's a very powerful break. That is a very powerful division. The Jews of no religion are not only less religious, which is exactly what you expect, they are less involved, less engaged in Jewish life. They are less likely to say they feel a great deal of belonging to the Jewish people. They're less likely to say they feel a sense of responsibility to help fellow Jews in need around the world. They're less likely to say being Jewish, not the Jewish religion, but being Jewish is important to them. And of course, they're much less likely to be a synagogue member or to have donated to a Jewish cause or charity. Now, this is not writing them out of the Jewish people. That's not the point of this question or this division, but we shouldn't blind ourselves that we've got, by age, just to go back again, this group is rising as a share of American Jews. It's rising overall, and it's rising by age, and they are less connected. But at the same time, we also have the Orthodox that are growing. So we have this kind of religious divergence among the youngest set of Jewish adults in the United States, where they are both more Orthodox and somehow paradoxically less Jewishly engaged and less likely to identify with the Jewish religion at all than older Jews. That's what I'm calling religious divergence. It is somewhat tied in with questions of political polarization that I'll get into in a moment, but inherently, this is not a political division, and I'm not talking about it as polarization for that reason.
Alan, if
Yes.
you could, I want to be sensitive to people's time, and I want to give some time for questions. Do you think you could finish up in another 5 minutes or so?
Yes, I think I can race through this and be done in 5 minutes.
Thanks.
We asked some questions. Thank you, Diane. We asked some questions about why people go to synagogue among those who go monthly or more and why they don't. And I'm going to focus here just on the bottom bars. It's kind of interesting, the reasons that people say they don't go. I'm just not religious. I'm not interested. I express my Jewishness in other ways. So actually, issues of cost were not a major factor for most American Jews who don't attend synagogue, for example, though that was one of the things offered. There's more about this in the survey report if you want to see it. But I want to focus on that last one. I express my Jewishness in other ways, because one of the things we did in this survey that I think is very important and actually could be very useful to at least some of you is to explore for the first time ways that people engage in Jewish life, but not religiously. So we asked her things like, how often do you cook or eat traditional Jewish foods? How often do you visit synagogues or Jewish sites when traveling? How often do you mark Shabbat in a way that's meaningful to you, even if it's not a traditional observance? How often do you read Jewish newspapers? How often do you listen to Jewish or Israeli music? How often do you go to Jewish film festivals or so on? All this data is in the survey report. And I sometimes have gotten in the past, Diane, this question, these Jews of no religion, these nuns, how do we reach them? If we want to bring them in to our life and we want to make them more Jewish and we want to help them care about Israel and so on, how do we reach these people? And here's the answer. They do all these same things in basically the same order of frequency, but all at lower levels. So the Jews of no religion are also cooking or eating Jewish foods, and it's the number one thing they do, just in sort of cult of all the things we asked about, a dozen or so things we asked about in the survey, it's the most common of them. Also, 40% of Jews of no religion say they share Jewish culture or holidays with friends. A third say they visit Jewish sites when traveling. These numbers are lower than among Jews by religion, but they're not non-existent. And again, the pattern is the same, sort of the levels of frequency. So this is a kind of roadmap, I think, to Jewish leaders and organizations, if that's one of the things that you want to do. Where are these people? How do we find them? What are they in fact doing? Because they're not in synagogues. What are they doing? Well, this gives you a bit of a roadmap. Anyway, that's my hope for it. I want to talk about some age patterns. And here there's an awful lot of data being shown on one chart, but each colored dot represents a different age group. And so the overall pattern that I want you to think about is that when the dots are close together, it means there are no big differences by age. When the dots are far apart, it means there are significant age differences. And so most of these questions, what's interesting is that younger Jews do all these things at roughly equal rates with older Jews, with maybe the exception of watching TV. So shtisel, or watching TV in general, is not the thing for younger Jews, but they're doing all these things at roughly equal rates to older Jews. There's not a discernible age drop-off. Political polarization, I think you all know this. Jews as a whole in 2020, in the midst of a very polarizing political election campaign, Jews as a whole leaned about as strongly Democratic as they have in previous campaigns. That number is pretty consistent going back decades. Orthodox Jews are now as solidly Republican, or I say now, in 2020, we're as solidly Republican as Jews overall were Democratic. And Orthodox Jews have been becoming more Republican. Jews as a whole have not been becoming more Democratic, but Orthodox Jews have been becoming more Republican. In 2013, 57% of Orthodox Jews were Republican. In 2020, 75%. In terms of self-identification with political ideology, very similar, and again, kind of polar opposite pictures. Jews as a whole, 50% identify as liberal, most of the rest is moderate. Among Orthodox, 60% identify as conservative, most of the rest as moderate. And ethnicity and race. We didn't ask people whether they consider themselves Jews of color. So I don't know how many people consider themselves Jews of color, but we did ask race and ethnicity, both of individual respondents and about every other person living in their household, adults and children. And we see a very striking pattern by age. So overall, the Jewish population is still a largely white, non-Hispanic population. 92% identify as white and non-Hispanic, 4% as Hispanic, 1% as Black or African American, and about 3 percentage points as some combination of that includes a non-white category. But among Jews under the age of 30, fully 15% identify with one or more of those non-white Hispanic, non-Hispanic categories. And there is one statistic you'll see in the report itself. It's got a lot of attention. 17% of Jewish adults say they now live in a household in which at least one other person, child or adult, is not non-white. And that other person may or may not be Jewish, because there are a lot of non-Jews in living in Jewish households overall. But again, 17% of Jewish adults live in a household in which at least one person is not white. And among Jews under the age of 30, it's 29% live in a household in which at least one person is not white. So the Jewish population does, like the US population as a whole, seem to be growing more racially and ethnically diverse by age. And that's it. There's a sort of summary, which I don't need to go over and waste time with, and you know how to find me. PewResearch.org is the website. You can find all this information on the website. My email address, if you want to jot it down, I'm always happy to hear from any of you. It's first initial Cooperman @PewResearch.org. And I'm at your disposal, except when I'm on vacation in the Berkshires. But even then, maybe, if Diane asks.
Well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate this. We do have a few questions. I actually, if you don't mind, would like to start with the slide that you were uncomfortable with, the one that talked about what you have heard in person versus what you have heard as hearsay. I could create a hypothesis about why there's such a large divergence between those two numbers. That has to be statistically significant, 9% versus 60%. But are there any hypotheses that you have come up with in that regard?
It's media coverage and maybe social media. Younger people are seeing it on social media. Probably older people are seeing it in conventional media, but they're reading about it. So they're reading about Holocaust denial, but they're not actually experiencing somebody saying to their face, the Holocaust didn't happen, or it wasn't 6 million, or whatever.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought. And I would have thought largely social media. Okay, Rachel, next question, please.
The next question is from Johanna Gutman of Emuna.
Hi, thank you so very much for a very comprehensive presentation. I was wondering, I don't know if you've done any research on it, if you've seen similar trends among Muslim Americans in terms of their engagement or participation in traditionally Muslim activities, politics, whatever it may be.
Yeah, we have done 3 surveys of Muslim Americans. The most recent was, I think, in 2017. The Muslim population in the United States is a majority foreign-born, majority immigrant population, unlike the Jewish population, which is only about 15% foreign-born. And foreign-born populations tend to be more socially conservative in a variety of ways, much lower rates of intermarriage, and Muslim Americans, especially foreign-born Muslim Americans, have relatively high rates of religious orthodoxy in a kind of Muslim perspective. And they don't have a clear denominational breakdown that gives us that, but foreign-born Muslims are pretty likely to say that they pray 5 times a day, that they fast on Ramadan, and so on. But we do see similar patterns of younger Muslims, and especially American-born Muslims, being somewhat less religious. And of course, there's also about 1/3 of American Muslims are so-called African-American or Black Muslims, and that's a different population. Of course, it's native-born. So there's a lot of different things going on, but we don't really have a category of Muslims aside from religion, the way we have Jews aside from religion. And so I guess I'm trying to say, Johanna, that I see some parallels, but not exact. And frankly, the issues that really concern American Muslim leaders that they're eager for us to get at surveys in Muslim Americans are rather different from the issues that the American Jewish population and leadership seems to be interested in us. And there's also, frankly, much more research that's been done on Jews in the United States, not by us, but by others over many decades. There's a much greater base knowledge. And among Muslims, there's a much greater desire just to know basic numbers, basic demographic data, and so on. I hope I've answered, but you know what I can do afterwards is I can send you links to the Muslim study, and then you can read it for yourself and you can see what the parallels are. And Mormons, ditto for Mormons.
Yeah, if you could do that, maybe send it to Rachel and we can forward it to Johanna. Sure. Rachel, next question, please.
Next question is from Chuck Kaufman of Nabrith International.
Thank you, Alan, for this depressing, somewhat presentation, but very important and very useful. You asked our opinion about the delineation of the tropes in an earlier question. So here's my own, and you can take it as you wish. Given the publicity and the news coverage that the survey generates, I believe that specifying these tropes, if I may use a Likert reference, is a reminder that's either somewhat harmful or harmful. So that's my take on the subject. Maybe you'd like to at least react to that.
Well, that's why I asked the question. I guess I can say maybe fortunately, I've seen very little coverage of those questions in the general media. I don't know about you, but I've looked pretty comprehensively at coverage of the survey. And the pieces that have appeared in the New York Times, for example, have focused entirely on American Jewish attitudes toward Israel. Pieces that appeared that went over radio and over broadcast media, and nobody focused on the stereotypes. So maybe we got away with something there. But I think it's an important question and an ethical question. And I want you at least to know that my colleagues and I do wrestle with it. We're not sure what the right thing to do is. We have to kind of judge the value of the information we can learn against the possibility that by trying to measure something, we're also affecting it. There is a sort of Heisenberg principle at work here where, any time you try to observe society, you do affect it, and sometimes in ways that you may not intend. Some of my colleagues are very leery of these types of questions. We have asked them elsewhere in the world, and I will note that the ADL asks these questions much more liberally with lowercase l than we do. I really value and take into account, Chuck, what you said, and I think we'll think long and hard before we repeat these questions.
So Alan, we have a couple more questions. Can you go a couple of minutes beyond 12?
Oh, I absolutely can. I'm at your
Okay.
disposal. If people want to
Okay.
continue on, I'll stay with you for sure.
I just want to add, Alan, that I did not mean to suggest at all that the question is an unethical one or an invalid one. I think it is, but I just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
I hear you, Chuck. I really do. And I appreciate it. Thank you for speaking up.
Sure.
I think we have a follow-up question from Harriet Schleifer.
So thank you. It was very interesting to see the demographics of the American Jewish population, of course, being more generally Caucasian. Has the Pew organization done that kind of demographic study on the Israeli population, which I think is at least 51% non-Caucasian, North African, people of color, Mizrahi, Sephardi? I think it would be an excellent showcase of the diversity of Israel that could help combat anti-Semitism by those who would equate Jews with white privilege.
We have. We've done one major survey of religion in Israel in 2015, and we did look at that. The Israeli categories are different from the American categories and not directly comparable. If you were to ask about Blackness in Israel, of course, there are Jews from sub-Saharan Africa, as we all know, and they physically present as Black and may even consider themselves Black. I don't know that for sure, but that's not a category we ask about. So as you yourself said, we ask about Sephardi and Mizrahi in Israel. And Sephardi and Mizrahi also don't map directly on Black, white, Hispanic in the United States. And it's actually one of the great complicating factors. And frankly, the thing that we and our advisors went round and round about was the most controversial aspect of putting this survey together was how we were going to talk about those things. And I'll give you the quick reason why. It's because you got a substantial share of American Jews who are Hispanic, but many of those are actually Ashkenazi. So their families came, I'm telling you what you already know, but from Poland or Germany or wherever, and moved to, Buenos Aires or Bolivia or wherever they moved to in Latin America, and then came to the United States. But they're actually of Ashkenazic descent. So some of our advisors said, well, you can't treat those people as Hispanic. And I said, well, but they said they're Hispanic, so I'm not. But so we, in the back of the report, we've put together these charts where you can, if you want, you can see and you can sort of subtract out the Ashkenazic Hispanics from, or you can add in the people who identify as white, but identify as Mizrahi, because people from the Middle East, as you know, are classified by the US Census as white. In the US categories, they may describe themselves as white and non-Hispanic. They may not see themselves as people of color or be seen as people of color, but in Jewish perspective, they may be. So it's a very common, these two things are, they just don't mesh.
It's complicated. That's clear. We've got 2 more questions and that'll be it. So Rahel, next question, please.
The next question is from Rabbi Steve Guto.
Hi, Steve. Good to see you.
Hey, Alan, great to see you also. I actually just wanted to ask this question because of your last few comments. So I hope I didn't get you in any trouble or me in any trouble. I wonder a lot about Mizrahi Jews, and I think that there are a significant number, and they may not be, of the Jews in America. Certainly in certain areas they are. What made you make the decision, you know, with all the other things that you were showing, some tiny percentages of Jews in certain areas, to not, you know, you said there was a big discussion about whether or not.
Oh, no, we have it. It's all in the report. I didn't show it. One of you thanked me for a comprehensive overview, and I guess it was long, but it was far from comprehensive. Yeah, so we asked about Mizrahi and Sephardi and Ashkenazi identity, and it's all there in the report. It's a relatively small percentage of American Jews who identify as Mizrahi. And we get, even if you take all the people who identify as Mizrahi, Sephardi, or any combination of things that includes Mizrahi or Sephardi, you only get up to about 6% of American Jews. Now, what's 6%? Is Jews are 2% of the US population, and we think they matter a lot in America. So I'm not saying 6% doesn't matter, but you know, that's what it is. It's nowhere, it's not a.
Okay, thank you.
Rahel, our last question, please.
The last question is from Malcolm Homeline.
Thank you very much for this really interesting and complicated presentation. I mean, I find a lot of things that appear to be contradictory, but we have to look at it in much more detail in order to assess that. But I wanted to ask you what you think the surge of anti-Semitism in the past year impacted the results on identification, not necessarily religious, but on both whether they experience it and whether that will drive people to re-identify. I am finding that anecdotally amongst certain groups that were more alienated from the community are coming back because of the reaction. And how do your results correlate to, let's say, with the more recent ADL and other studies in terms of reaction? And lastly, do you think that as they grow older, then the shift will take place where they become close to the community, want more religious experience, will attend synagogue, even if it's a communal experience, than they do as young people, which I think has always been true.
Malcolm, 3 really great, tough questions. Let me try. But let me first say that you said there's a lot that's contradictory. And listen, I think life is contradictory and we can't oversimplify it. And I don't also want to overcomplexify it, but you know, people are not consistent, honestly. Something just jumps out at you if you do surveys. People give you contradictory answers all the time about themselves and about others. And so we sort of let the chips fall where they may. Now, anti-Semitism and its impact. Well, this survey is not going to give us, because a lot of these questions are new and because of methodological differences, et cetera, I just cannot pretend to tell you that we have good, really measures of change in anti-Semitism over time. In fact, what I would say is that a number of our questions are what, as a survey guy, I call a poor man's trend. What I mean by that is what we really would want to have is we want to ask people, did you experience this? And have them asked that at like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and then ask them 10 years ago and then ask them now. And then you'd have a real trend over time. Instead, we're asking people questions like, do you feel less safe than you did 5 years ago? We didn't ask them how safe they felt 5 years ago. We're asking, do you feel less safe? And that's a poor man's trend. It's asking people to analyze their own experiences. Should definitely be taken with a grain of salt. It's not, in that sense, the best possible measure. It's just what we've got. I agree with you, by the way. My gut tells me in lots of ways that anti-Semitism has, I mean, it's a horrible thing and nobody wants anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism will, over time, if it is high, increase the coherence, the cohesiveness of the Jewish population. It's just human nature. That's the way things are. And for years, I have tried to point this out to people in perhaps a not very subtle way, and a little bit, well, clearly tongue in cheek. But when people have lamented to me after the 2013 study, what they saw as the astoundingly high rates of intermarriage. And people said to me, what should we do about it? What should we do about intermarriage? It's 70% of non-Orthodox Jews who've gotten married in the last few years have married non-Jews. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I say, first of all, I'm Pewish, not Jewish. So it's not my job to tell you what to do. I give you the data, you figure out what to do. Second answer, they say, but there's an obvious answer. If you want to drive down intermarriage, drive up anti-Semitism. And they go, whoa. And I said, well, look, I'm not actually seriously recommending an increase in anti-Semitism, but you have to see the flip side of the coin, which is that these various kinds of degrees of assimilation, that's the old-fashioned word, they are, the flip side of that is that Jews are welcome, admired, and desired in American life. And non-Jews want Jews as husbands and wives. And you know, what greater testament to acceptance of Jewishness can there be than that? But anti-Semitism, if it persists over time, will have the effect, I say this without data, but I say this on the basis of knowing human nature and sociology, it will have the effect of making a stronger, more coherent Jewish population. Last part of your question was how to compare our data to ADL data. Look, I think what we're all seeing, and B'nai B'rith and AJC, everybody's finding that there's a rise in anti-Semitism. We ask the question in different ways, so we're getting different numbers. I wouldn't try to line up their numbers against our numbers. I would just look at the general trend. There's now more than sufficient evidence to suggest that anti-Semitism along multiple dimensions has risen in American life and that American Jews are feeling it. Is it coming from the left or coming from the right or more from one than from the other? Is it felt more on campuses than in this space? That I don't know. That I can't really tell you. We don't have the ability to say, look at these data by Jews who are on college campuses versus others. The last thing I'll point out is that the Pew data are relatively lowercase c conservative. You'll note, for example, that when we asked about people's experiences, we carefully differentiated between firsthand and secondhand. But when we asked the question about do you feel or have you not participated, that we filtered that on the people who told us they felt less safe. So we weren't giving people an opportunity, fancy survey words, whatever, we weren't giving people a way to express their anxiety by attributing themselves an experience that they might not actually have had. So we tend to be very conservative about the way we measure these things. There are other organizations that are not so conservative, and that's fine. I mean, there's a good, it's vive la différence, or as I say in Israel.
In Yiddish, yeah.
In Yiddish.
Well, there's another one that's plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Which, anyway, listen, thank you so much, Alan, for spending this time with us and really going through the data in detail so that we can try to understand it. As Malcolm said, it's a lot to absorb, but I think really very important for everybody on the phone who is really engaged in the Jewish world and in the safety and security of Israel to really understand. So we really appreciate your time and thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Let me reiterate my availability to you all. I do hope you will actually go and read the report, and no doubt questions and things will occur to you. Be a little bit patient with me, but please do not hesitate to write me an email and I will get back to you. It might not be that day, but I will get back to you. And yeah, because this is our purpose. This is what I get paid to do. It's not just out of love for you.
Alan, if you're comfortable, we have had a couple of requests for the slides. So if you're
I can share this. I'll share the slides with you. In fact, I sent them to Ruben in advance, so I think you already have them.
So we
Feel
can send
free
them to
to-
anyone who
I
requests.
would ask that we don't like to send slides to people who haven't seen the presentation because they can be too easily misunderstood,
Okay,
but use your judgment.
Thank you. We'll certainly put that caveat on if we send them out. Thank you very much. We appreciate it, everybody. Take care.
Thank you,
Thank
Diane.
you all. Excellent presentation.